breaking down the cost associated with closing on a real estate transaction.
Just like you'd have a contingency line item for going over budget or possibly running over budget, or getting some skeletons in the closet on a BRRRR or something like that. Do the same for like professional services.
So what are the typical breakdowns of an average real estate transaction?
So normally we can give a detailed account estimate up front. So that would, let the clients have some transparency on what to expect for legal fees, office disbursements, and HST. We can calculate for them their land transfer tax and their registration costs, up front as well.
What's going on YouTube? It's Rebecca Lynn Matheson here, aka the Canadian Cottage Girl, and welcome to the Canadian Real Estate Channel. Today I've got Ryan Carson here from Carson Law to break down all of the closing costs associated with a real estate transaction. Welcome to the channel, Ryan.
Hey, thanks, Rebecca. Thanks for having me as usual. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I'm taking over the channel for Matt McKeever today, and we're certainly going to break down from start to finish what you can expect for potential costs that could pop up during a real estate investment transaction and just real estate transaction in general. So let's start from the top here, Ryan. I have a contract in place, and now I bring it to you. I say, hey, will you be my real estate lawyer? We go through the introductions. What from start to finish should I expect as a first-time investor to actually encounter when I'm seeking out a lawyer?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I mean, what I'll do is I'll kind of use our process just to kind of walk through what the example might look like, because I'll just use our process and how we handle it from start to finish for what somebody should expect. Because I think we do a pretty thorough job on it. I think we do a fairly transparent job. And I mean, other firms will probably be doing potentially something similar. But if you're working with somebody and they don't do any of this, then you might want to maybe inquire why or whatever. But obviously cost, especially with a real estate investor, is a big deal. Because obviously all your dollars and cents matter to determine whether or not this is going to be, an effective and profitable investment. So you've got your return on investment you're hoping for and meeting your investor targets and everything, so that you can, develop good rapport and have repeat business. So our firm tries to be as transparent as we possibly can. We also caution clients that, look, there's certain things that will come out in the process that it's impossible to know entirely up front and to know all the amounts up front, but there's certainly a good chunk of cost and fees that can be laid out early on in the process so that people are aware and able to budget and have an expectation of what those might be and so forth. So when people typically, come to us and say, hey, I've got a deal, I've heard about you, could you be our lawyer? Could you give us an idea of what the costs would be? We usually ask to see a copy of the agreement of purchase and sale. And then from there, we've got an account estimate and email that gives you a lot of good information about the account estimate and about some of your other fees and costs that you might expect to see through the life of the file. But we try to give people as detailed an account estimate as we possibly can so they can see, the lawyer's fees for their time, the lawyer's disbursements for the office. Those are like commonly the conveyancing, title search cost of the land registry office, registration fees, bank fees. Those are your big ticket disbursements. Sometimes there could be some courier costs still, some some deals do require original closing documents still by courier. So tax certificates, these are some of the bigger ticket disbursements of the lawyer's office that you would see on like our account estimate. And then of course HST, right? So the items that we won't know up front, because we won't know them until we get closer along in the process, will be the actual title insurance on a purchase, because the insurance company has to process it and send back the premium estimate. So we won't know that, unfortunately. We can typically sometimes get an estimate from them as well, but that typically does take maybe a couple days to get. But so we do let the clients know, in addition to this account estimate, you're going to have title insurance costs, and you're going to have the government registration fees, which right now I think are about $77.62 per registration. So that's like registering a deed, registering a mortgage. If you're talking about real estate investors, typically assignments of rent as well get registered. So you'd have to factor those into your budget. And then, of course, land transfer tax. So for everything outside of the Greater Toronto area, it's just provincial land transfer tax. And as long as we know the purchase price, we can plug into a land transfer tax calculator and tell the clients exactly what that would be for the province of Ontario. But if you're inside the boundary lines of Toronto and you're investing in Greater Toronto area, then there is the provincial and municipal land transfer taxes. So it's essentially doubled. So if your provincial land transfer tax was $5,000, for example, your land transfer tax for a Toronto transaction is going to be $10,000. So it'll be double.
Got it. Now, for that land transfer, just before you get into more, is there a certain calculator that you recommend online, or do you have a specific one that you use?
You can kind of type in Ontario land transfer tax calculator, and a good one that I like is just bring it up right now, actually, on Rate Hub. So ratehub.ca has a land transfer tax calculator, and it's pretty good, very simple. Just asks you to put in the price and the location, and if you're a first-time home buyer, and then it'll give you provincial, municipal, and rebate.
Okay,
so it breaks it right down. So it's www.ratehub.ca/land transfer tax Ontario.
That's great. I've got it up right here. I'm going to just test this out. So Burlington, Ontario, let's say,
that's the one.
Let's test out a few different rates here. So if we have a $500,000 property in Burlington, Ontario, we've got a land transfer tax here of around $6,500. I can actually click, I'm a first-time home buyer, and it actually shows the rebate as well, which is kind of cool.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah, and people might ask, so I'm a first-time home buyer. Now, keep in mind, if you're an investor, to qualify for the rebate, you actually need to be moving into the property to use it as a personal residence. So if you're buying your very first property ever, but it's going to be an investment property and you're not going to live there, then unfortunately you won't be able to utilize the rebate. Because one of the criteria to qualify for the first-time home buyer credit is that you've not owned a property anywhere in the world. If you're married to a spouse, that they haven't either, and that you'd be moving into their property as a principal residence. So if any one of those factors and criteria are not met, then unfortunately you can't get the rebate.
Of course. Okay, definitely appreciate that context there. It's good to know. And that seems like just a great, easy resource to, as an informed consumer, to be able to go on and check, so that when you're having that conversation with your real estate lawyer, you kind of know what to expect. Because I guess it doesn't really matter which real estate lawyer you're working with, that's going to be a consistent fee across the table.
Those criteria for the first-time home buyer credit and rebate are just levied by the provincial government. So every lawyer is going to be subject to the same rules and requirements there.
Yeah.
I mean, some other items that you might want to be aware of when you're looking at like the statement of adjustments, which is going to be the document between the lawyers that breaks down like the purchase price, the deposit. It's also going to have things on adjustments for property taxes. So if there's been an overpayment or an underpayment by the seller, that over underpayment gets adjusted on the statement of adjustments. So you'd have to try to factor in a bit of a buffer there. Usually your lawyers are going to make sure that they're paid up to date or overpaid. So there's usually a credit to the seller. So there's some sort of readjustment going on there at the time of closing that certain investors or first-time home buyers might not be aware of. So you have to kind of budget that. Depending on the type of property, there could be adjustments for things like propane tanks, oil tanks, water accounts, depending on if the property's like commercial or not. There's sometimes specific adjustments for rents. You know, so if you are assuming tenants, there's typically going to be adjustments for the current month of rent and any like last month rent that somebody has on file or anything like that. So those are typically adjustments and costs that somebody would want to be aware of or sort of have knowledge of so that they can properly budget themselves for the cost of the transaction.
Got it. Absolutely. Now, you mentioned several costs that would be incurred at the beginning there. Do you have even ranges that are typical for an investor or for a first-time home buyer to kind of start budgeting for the real estate fees? So you mentioned things like the actual transaction cost, potential of having to deliver any funds as well. So what are the typical breakdowns of an average real estate transaction?
So normally we can give a detailed account estimate up front. So that would, you know, let the clients have some transparency on what to expect for legal fees, office disbursements, and HST. We can calculate for them their land transfer tax and their registration costs, you know, upfront as well. The title insurance, you know, within a couple of days, we could get probably an estimate for them as well, as long as we know, you know, what kind of mortgage or financing they're using and who it's from, because the title insurance company will want to know that. And then obviously their plans for the use of the property, because that might vary the policy that we're ordering or getting an estimate on for the title insurance. So, I mean, definitely those are kind of the main you know, the high level and main items that are going to be of significance for the client. I mean, the property tax adjustment, depending on the property, it's usually not much more than a couple hundred to maybe you know, I don't even know if you'd see a couple thousand in a readjustment there. It's probably normally more like a couple hundred. If you're dealing with like bigger multi-res or commercial properties, maybe it could be a couple $1,000s of property tax adjustment. But it's typically, you know, it's not typically that big of an adjustment. The big ticket ones would be like the rent rolls. If you're buying a property as an investor, that's probably going to be the biggest, you know, the biggest possible adjustments that could have a significant impact on a credit for or against the buyer, right? Other real estate investment acquisition. So really knowing your rent rolls, which would be part of your due diligence you'd want to do anyways in acquiring the property. You know, really knowing your rent rolls and what they have for the current month's rent and any deposits, etc. Those are going to be important to know, because they could greatly increase or decrease your balance due on closing for the buyer.
Got it. Now let's break that down a little bit. So let's go through a possible scenario with rent rolls. So let's say you buy, let's a triplex. So let's keep it super simple. We have a triplex, 3 units, all 3 units are rented and we're acquiring the tenants. And what are the possible scenarios here for the breakdown that you had described?
Yeah, so the statement of adjustments is going to have like the purchase price. So that'll be a credit for the seller. And there's a deposit credit that will be a credit for the buyer. There could be a property tax credit, which it could be for or against the seller or buyer, but normally it's a credit of, you know, some amount, couple $100 for the seller. And then typically, as long as the like if we take today, for example, September 7th, as the closing date, well, the tenants have probably already on September 1st paid their September rent.
Right.
So that's something that the seller's already received and is getting, like, they're keeping it. So what they need to do is there needs to be a prorated adjustment credited to the buyer on the statement of adjustments for the 3 units. So there'll be credits for the, you know, the 23 days of September for them on the statement of adjustments. So that'll save the buyers a bit of money because they'll just start collecting rent from the tenant October 1st.
Yeah. So does that typically come just directly out of the purchase price? So we have our agreement of purchase and sale price, and then we have the breakdown of what's essentially owed by the seller to the buyer for rents. In that, let's say from the 7th onward, we have the rest of the rents for September. Is that typically just credited from that agreement of purchase and sale price?
Yeah, that's right.
Got it. And what about, say, first and last month's rent? So that's pretty standard for any rentals, is to pay both first and last month's rent. So would that last month's rent also be credited in that adjustment?
Yeah, that's right. If there is any first and last or deposit or anything like that, whatever the seller has, record of, and whatever they previously received from the tenants, that they would need to be transferring over to the buyer. Those would all end up being credits for the buyer on the statement of adjustments. So ultimately they get knocked off. They all get knocked off the balance due on closing price that they're paying to the seller. But the buyer has to remember, if they have three tenants there, and 3 deposits, so to speak, they have to account for that and put that aside in their, record keeping. So they can't just get the benefit of the credit, but then not show on their records that they in fact, are supposed to be holding some sort of deposit for tenants 1, 2, and 3.
Absolutely. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense from a rental standpoint. And it's just another consideration if you are going to be acquiring any tenants in your properties, is just how that adjustment goes. Now, let's say that the seller just doesn't have record of it. Maybe they were kind of slipping on their accounting. What happens then, and what documents can you get from them if, say, they don't have copies of leases to actually prove out the rent that's coming in?
Sorry, can you say that part again?
Of course, yeah. So scenario would be, let's say you're buying a property and the seller doesn't necessarily have the best of records. Maybe they lost the lease agreements, or they don't have those anymore because the tenants have been staying there for so long. What sorts of documents can you actually get so that you can ensure that you have everything accounted for in that statement of adjustment?
Yeah, I mean, it's true. It's sometimes tough. Some people are much better at keeping records than others. But I mean, the one document that gets signed by both the buyers and the sellers, which is, a bit of protection and a safeguard, is an undertaking to do readjustments after closing. So this document does protect the buyer if the seller's record keeping was in error, or they missed something, or whatever the case is. It basically says the parties have to agree to do adjustments post closing. So this predominantly is normally for like property tax reassessment, which sometimes happens, not often, but sometimes does. Or maybe they adjust that they've paid a certain amount of property taxes, and it turns out that they were misunderstood or misinformed, but the records with the city don't support how much they said they paid. So these sorts of things, and the same thing would be true for the rents. If they said, oh yeah, we collected this much for, tenant 1, 2, and 3, and have these damage deposits or first and last months. And then it turns out, you find out, that wasn't right, in part or in full, that undertaking to readjust by the seller, that they sign on closing, gives the buyer some protections, and so does title insurance. Not necessarily on all things, but title insurance, for example, if there was an issue with the property taxes and the seller wasn't readjusting property taxes properly after closing as per their undertaking, title insurance at no cost to the client would pay what is owed by the seller, and then they just go after the seller. So there are some benefits over and above fraud protection for why it's good to get title insurance on closings.
Absolutely. Yeah. So aside from those standard things, so get title insurance for sure. And also you're going to have your land transfer taxes. What is the average cost to if everything goes right and we don't have a ton of these adjustments, what's the average cost for a lawyer on just a standard single family home? Is it around $1,200, $1,500? Are we looking at $2,000, upwards of that? What's the average cost for a real estate lawyer?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say because everybody kind of operates like their own ways. And everybody sort of pays some of their costs differently. For example, I know a lot of lawyers will pay their title insurance as a trust ledger item, so it doesn't show on the account, which makes the lawyer's account look lower. But I pay my title insurance not out of trust, but out of general funds. So it has to show up on my account. It's just a different way of people liking to process their bills or whatever. But at the end of the day, the net result's the same. The buyer is acquiring a title insurance policy. It's not like one way is more expensive than the other for the client. They're identical costs, et cetera. They're just paid out of things differently. Some people put registration fees on the ledger. Some people put them on their account. Again, it's completely kind of up to the, the lawyer and what their preference is. If we're talking about a purchase with a mortgage, single family, and it's under 750,000, we're probably around 18 to 1900. That's legal fees, disbursements, HST. The only amounts that wouldn't be included in that is title insurance, land transfer tax, and registration fees.
Absolutely.
So
and then
we're in there.
Absolutely. And then as we get into higher ticket properties, larger multifamilies, then it takes a lot more due diligence and work, I presume. So the lawyer fees go up.
If it's over 750, single family, or they're multi-res and commercial properties, the time that it takes for us to do the file can go up exponentially. So the cost is greater. But I wouldn't say it goes like our fees go up exponentially. We do everything like on a block retainer. We try to make sure like everybody has transparency of the fees and costs up front. We have the client sign retainer agreements at the outset of every file where it reiterates again, this is what your legal fee is. If a circumstance arose where something was outside of the scope of the retainer, like the usual processing of that file type, the easiest thing I can think of is like we have to negotiate an extension or something like that. We always let the clients know, and it says this in the retainer, that you'd have to pay that additional time at the lawyer's hourly rate. But even then, it's most extensions can be negotiated for $1,000 or less. We're trying to, especially with the real estate investor client, we're trying to obviously make sure we're establishing a good relationship at the outset, so that it's a medium to long term relationship and not one file and done. It's a big community, real estate investors, but it's also small circles. Lots of people are running across the same people, networking group and informational groups, as you go one to the other. And we'd like to think that we've got a good reputation in all of those different circles. And hopefully it's because we try to treat people fairly. We try to be transparent. We try to be as understanding and helpful as possible, file to file. And again, like I said, we're trying to build a long-term relationship. So if, on one deal, we don't make as much money, we're not worried, because we'd rather have 100 deals than one. So.
Yeah, that makes sense. And at the end of the day, the legal fees are actually a very low cost item in the whole entire process of the closing. So making sure that you have the power team behind you, it's very reasonable in terms of the actual transaction. So I think that just setting up that line item and just being like, okay, this is roughly how much it's going to cost for a lawyer, and overestimating that a little bit just in case things go wrong, like you have to do extra title searches or you have unforeseen circumstances during closings like extensions. I think that those are all really important elements for any investor to prepare for and consider. Absolutely. So definitely appreciate that breakdown. And I think that calculator there for land transfer tax is definitely going to be a very effective tool. If you guys aren't already using that tool, I highly recommend that you go on there and check that out. We'll make sure that the link for that website as well is just down in the description below, so you guys can actually utilize that tool and definitely differentiate and budget for the cost of purchase among different areas. Like you said, Toronto, you're going to have to account for basically double the land transfer taxes, whereas outside of the city, you're looking at about half of that cost. And that is subject to whatever the purchase price is. That's what we're basing that land transfer tax off of primarily. Awesome. Ryan, do you have anything else to cover here in closing costs? I think we've got a pretty holistic perspective there from start to finish, all of the possible outcomes that could go wrong here, and also just a great breakdown of expectations so that we can take that data, not drama approach when we're setting up for success in our real estate transactions.
I don't have anything specific, maybe just a general comment. As a real estate investor, lawyer, and investor, and you mentioned it and alluded to it, try to put in, just like you'd have a contingency line item for going over budget or possibly running over budget, or, getting some skeletons in the closet on a BRRRR or something like that. Do the same for professional services. Try to build in a buffer of a couple thousand or maybe up to 5,000. Again, if better to have it and not need it than need it and not have it. And if you build it in and you don't need any of it, then it just means that's going to be added to your bottom line and to your possible investor. Now you automatically made them an extra $5,000 or whatever your number is, right? So even though you really didn't, you just did some conservative budgeting, right? So I think it's a good idea to kind of build that in, especially if you're doing real estate investing, and especially as you start to grow and go maybe more aggressively at bigger and more complex deals, like the multi-res and the commercial, especially. There's more moving parts to those, and unfortunately there can just be then more surprises, that you do your best to try to foresee or budget for and deal with, but sometimes it's just not possible.
Absolutely. I definitely appreciate that, Ryan. And having that buffer zone can really make sure that you're not stressed during closing either, that you're just prepared and that everything goes seamlessly and smooth. You don't want to be scrounging at the end of the day and really tight to that budget line. So I can definitely appreciate that. And Ryan, thanks again for dropping all these knowledge bombs on the channel. And we'll definitely make sure that if you want to reach out to the Carson Law team, that their information is down below so that you have all the resources necessary. I can definitely speak from personal experience that the Carson Law team is very effective and quick on closings. So the power team is definitely something that you're going to want to build out experienced power team members, people who actually do real estate transactions on a regular basis. And it's something that you want to make sure that you're prepared for from all angles. So Ryan, thanks for popping onto the channel today and kind of breaking down the cost associated with closing on a real estate transaction.